The morning my sister found my lake house, she was not coming to see me. She was coming to calculate what I was worth. I was sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee cooling between my hands, watching the mist rise off Lake Champlain like the whole world was finally learning how to leave me alone. At 63 years old, after 31 years as a patent engineer in Burlington, Vermont, I had built myself a quiet life. No household noise, no family arguments echoing through the walls, no mortgage, no debt, just the water, the trees, and a silence so clean it almost felt expensive. For most of my life, nobody in my family thought I was worth much. My sister Lorraine called me boring with that thin little smile she used when she wanted the insult to sound harmless. Her husband Glenn was worse. At my mother's funeral, while I was still holding the program with her photograph on the front, he leaned over to someone beside him and said I had peaked in high school. I heard him. I just did not answer. That was always my mistake, according to people like them. I was too quiet, too ordinary, too easy to dismiss. But quiet men have a habit of hearing everything. Ordinary men have a habit of keeping records. And people who dismiss you too early usually forget to check what you'd have been building while they were laughing. By the time Lorraine's car turned into my driveway that February morning, I already knew one thing. They had not come for me. They had come for the money. If you have ever been underestimated by your own family, stay with me. And if stories about betrayal, quiet proof, and justice that arrives at exactly the right moment are the kind that pull you in, subscribe for more stories like this one. The thing Lorraine and Glenn never understood was that I had not been wasting my life. I had been building something they were too impatient to notice. For 31 years, I worked as a patent engineer at a mid-size manufacturing firm in Burlington. It was not glamorous work. Nobody applauded when a valve held pressure under testing. Nobody clapped when a design passed its 17th adjustment without failure. But I liked that kind of work. Quiet problems, precise answers, mistakes that showed themselves if you were patient enough to look. 6 years before I retired, I started working in my garage on a micro-compression valve system. The idea had been sitting in the back of my mind for a long time, before I gave it the space to grow. At first, it was just a few rough sketches on graph paper, then a series of measurements, then actual metal pieces, milled at a shop 2 towns over, coming home in a paper bag like ordinary groceries. I kept late nights under a yellow work lamp while the rest of the neighborhood went dark. I burned coffee on the hot plate more times than I can count. I ruined 3 good shirts with machine oil. I kept a notebook so detailed, so careful in its documentation of every adjustment and failed attempt that my attorney Francis once said it looked less like invention notes and more like a sworn confession. I never told Lorraine. I never told Glenn. I did not mention it at family dinners when they asked, with that particular brand of polite dismissal, whether I was still doing the same little job. I just nodded, cut my meat, and let them keep their version of me. Then, in 2023, a manufacturing conglomerate out of Ohio purchased the patent for $9.4 million. I remember sitting in Frances's office the afternoon the final number came through. She looked at the screen, adjusted her glasses slowly, and said only 2 words. "Well, good." That was Frances. No screaming, no champagne. Just legal clarity and a pen placed exactly where I needed to sign. She was the kind of woman who had seen enough money change hands to know that the real work was what came after. And she was already thinking 3 steps ahead. I was 61 years old, no mortgage, no debt, no one depending on me. And quietly, without any announcement, I had more money than Lorraine and Glenn had ever imagined I could touch. So I bought a house on Lake Champlain. And for the first time in decades, I did not tell my family where I had gone. The quiet lasted 4 months. That was longer than I expected, and not nearly long enough. I moved into the lake house in October, when the maples along the road had gone red and gold, and the air smelled like wet leaves and chimney smoke. I brought 3 boxes of books, a cast-iron skillet, my old drafting notebooks, and the best coffee maker I had ever allowed myself to own. The porch looked directly out over the water. On clear mornings, you could see the far shoreline like a dark brushstroke under the sky. For the first time in years, nobody was calling to ask me for favors. Nobody was making gentle jokes about my apartment or my furniture or my single-man habits. Nobody was looking at my life like it was evidence of something gone wrong. I ate dinner when I wanted to. I read until 2 in the morning without explaining it to anyone. I walked the property line in rubber boots and felt, for the first time in a very long while, that I had actually arrived somewhere I deserved to be. Then Dylan found me. Dylan was Lorraine and Glenn's youngest. He was 20 years old by then, and he had never quite fit inside that polished little family. He was quieter than the rest of them, more careful with his words. The kind of young man who noticed when a room changed temperature after someone said the wrong thing. He had come to my old apartment twice before, both times when his parents' marriage was falling apart in ways they refused to name out loud. I made him grilled cheese in a pan older than he was, poured him iced tea, and let him talk until the words ran out. I never pushed him. I never asked him to choose sides. I just gave him a table and something warm to eat. So when he mentioned my lake house to Lorraine, I do not believe he meant any harm. He probably said it the way a young person mentions good news, casually and without calculation. Something like, "Uncle Arthur seems happy. He has a place near Lake Champlain now." To Dylan, that was just an update. To Lorraine, it was a location. And to Glenn, once he heard it, it was an opportunity. 2 weeks later, on a cold February morning when the frost had not yet let go of the grass, Glenn's freshly detailed Audi rolled slowly into my driveway. Lorraine stepped out first, already smiling. Glenn followed a half-second behind, wearing the expression of a man who had decided before arriving that things were going to go his way. Then the back door opened and a man I barely recognized climbed out carrying a laptop bag over one shoulder and a folder pressed flat against his chest. That was the moment I understood this was not a visit. Lorraine hugged me first, but her eyes went past my shoulder before her arms had even fully touched me. She was looking at the kitchen windows, the stone walkway, the clean siding along the south wall, the stretch of land that rolled down quietly toward the water. My sister had always been skilled at performing warmth while calculating something else entirely, but that morning she was not performing well. What I saw moving behind her eyes was not love or relief or even mild happiness for her brother. It was math. "You never told us it was this beautiful," she said. "You never asked," I answered. Glenn laughed too quickly, then climbed the porch steps with both hands extended like he was already closing a deal. His coat carried the faint smell of expensive cologne, the kind men wear when they want people to forget about the bills sitting underneath the surface. "Arthur," he said, gripping my hand. "New chapter, huh? Big place for one man." Behind him, the younger man adjusted the strap on his laptop bag and offered me a careful smile. "This is Preston," Glenn said. "He is in finance now." I had met Preston 3 times in 20 years. Once at a wedding, where he drank too much too early. Once at a Christmas dinner where he talked over everyone at the table. Once at a funeral where he spent most of the service scrolling his phone with his thumb pressed against the side of his leg so no one would notice. Now he was standing on my porch with a laptop, a printed folder, and the quiet confidence of a man who had rehearsed his opening lines during the drive up. "We thought," Lorraine said, touching my arm, "since you are alone up here, it might be smart to have someone you trust looking after things." Things. Not me. Not my health. Not whether I had enough firewood stacked before the next hard frost. Things. Preston opened the folder before I had invited anyone inside. Neat tabs, color-coded, printed charts with gentle upward slopes. Words like estate protection and family trust and co-trustee oversight and wealth structure review. He said them softly, the way someone speaks to a nervous animal, gently and without pausing long enough for a response. Glenn leaned against the porch railing and smiled with his teeth. Family rates, he said, better than letting some stranger handle it. And there it was. That was the moment I understood the visit had been planned long before the Audi ever turned off the highway. They had not driven up to see my new home. They had arrived prepared to get inside it. I could have ended it right there. I could have told Glenn to take his printed folder and his rehearsed nephew and his cologne back down the mountain. I could have told Lorraine that real family does not arrive at your door with tabs and charts before asking how you slept. I could have closed the door while my coffee was still warm enough to drink. But I did not. Because in engineering, you do not judge a machine by the sound it makes when it starts. You let it run. You listen for the rattle. You watch where the pressure builds. You find the weak point before you touch a single screw. So I stepped aside and said, "Come in." Lorraine smiled the way people smile when they believe they have won something. Glenn wiped his shoes too carefully on the mat. Preston walked in, holding the laptop bag against his side, like it contained my future, already partially signed. I made coffee. That was the part they misread. They thought coffee meant comfort. They thought my questions meant interest. They thought my silence meant I was a lonely old man grateful for company and willing to mistake attention for affection. I let Lorraine admire the kitchen counters and run her fingers along the cabinet doors like she was measuring them. I let Glenn drift toward the windows overlooking the lake and stand there with his hands in his pockets, looking down at the water with the expression of a man picturing his name on a chair that was not yet his. I let Preston sit at my table and explain the concept of estate protection in a voice pitched perfectly between friendly and professional. All the while, I watched. I watched Glenn answer questions I had not asked. I watched Lorraine avoid eye contact whenever the conversation moved anywhere near specific numbers. I watched Preston use phrases he clearly did not fully understand, then glance sideways at Glenn before turning the page in his folder, waiting for a signal that the room was still going the right direction. I nodded. I asked for clarification on small points. I let them talk long enough to make themselves comfortable. By the time they left, I did not have a signed document in their hands. I had something considerably more useful. A clear and detailed memory of every lie they had carried into my house. The next morning, I called Frances before my second cup of coffee. "They came," I said. "I expected they would," she answered. That was Frances, calm, direct, no wasted questions. The kind of attorney whose silence feels like a locked door rather than an empty room. They brought Glenn's nephew, I told her, Preston. Claimed he was in finance, showed up with a whole trust proposal, printed and tabbed, before he had ever set eyes on my kitchen. There was a pause on the line long enough to mean she was thinking rather than filling silence. "How long do you want to let this run?" she asked. "Long enough to find out whether they are planning something," I said, "or whether they have already started." Frances told me not to sign anything. Not a page, not a writer, not a summary form. Then she said something that made the kitchen feel colder than it was. "Arthur, do not let them move in." I had not thought of that yet, but once she said it, I understood she was right. That was the next step in a plan like theirs. 1 foot in the door, then an overnight bag, then a conversation about how it made more financial sense to be close to family. 2 weeks after the visit, Lorraine called. She took 20 minutes to reach the point. Weather. A cousin's upcoming wedding. A home improvement program she had been watching that made her think of me for reasons she did not explain. Then, her voice softened into the register she used when she had already decided what she wanted. "You have all that space up there," she said. "Glenn and I thought maybe, just for a few months, while the market is difficult and the kids are in school." "No," I said. She went quiet, a long quiet. Then the warmth left her voice entirely. "After everything this family has done for you?" I did not argue. I said goodbye. And then I sat at the kitchen table for a long time looking at the lake. Frances, meanwhile, had already started working. She wrote a careful letter to the probate attorney Glenn had consulted, requesting documentation of the inquiry under the terms of a pending legal matter. The response confirmed what the timeline had already suggested. Glenn had contacted that office in January, 6 weeks before he arrived at my door with Preston and the printed folder. He had asked specific questions about what would happen to an estate with no will in place, how a family member could petition for financial oversight if an elderly relative appeared to be mismanaging wealth, and what the legal standard was for establishing that a person might need assisted financial management. He had done this before he ever set eyes on the lake, before he knew the size of the rooms, before he pretended to be concerned about whether I was lonely. Then Frances found the information about Preston. He was not a licensed financial advisor. He had completed an online certification course with no regulatory standing, built a polished profile on LinkedIn that used words like wealth management consultant and estate planning specialist, and had one elderly man in New Hampshire who was currently trying to recover $60,000 from an investment account Preston had managed on his behalf. The complaint had been filed. The case was unresolved. That was the moment I stopped thinking they were simply desperate people doing something clumsy out of financial pressure. They were organized. And then, in the second week of her investigation, Frances found the part that settled in my stomach like cold iron. Glenn had not only been asking about estate law. In correspondence with a business associate, he had described me to that person as isolated, aging, and possibly overwhelmed by sudden wealth. Those were his exact words, according to a document Frances obtained through her legal inquiry. Possibly overwhelmed. I sat at my kitchen table and read that phrase 3 times with my hands flat on the wood. That was not concern speaking. That was groundwork. If I signed something later, Glenn could say he had stepped in because I was confused. If I refused to sign, he could tell people I was being paranoid. If I got angry, he could point to the anger as evidence that I was not managing the stress of sudden money well. He had written himself a story in advance, and in that story, I was already a problem waiting to be solved by the right responsible family member. For the first time, I understood the shape of the full plan. They did not just want access to my money. They wanted a narrative that made taking control of it look responsible. Dylan called me in March from a parking lot. I knew before he said a word that something was wrong because of the quality of the sound behind his voice. Wind, distant traffic, the particular hollow echo of someone standing in an open space because he did not want to be heard inside a building. "Uncle Arthur," he said, barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something." I set my coffee down. "Go ahead." For a few seconds, there was only his breathing and the sound of the wind moving across the parking lot. "Mom and Glenn have been talking about you every night," he said. "Not normal talking. Not how is he talking. Paperwork, lawyers, your house, your money. Glenn keeps saying you are getting older and you need family close by before strangers take advantage of the situation." I looked out the window toward the lake. The water was still flat and gray from winter, the color of something not yet decided. There were documents spread out on the kitchen counter last Tuesday night, Dylan continued. I could not read everything, but your name was on them, in a lot of places. I know, I said quietly. He stopped. You know? I know enough. His voice shifted when I said that. Something cracked at the edge of it, not quite tears, but close. I did not tell them where you lived to cause any of this, he said. I just mentioned it because you seemed happy. I thought Mom would be glad to know you were doing well. That was Dylan, young enough still to believe that happiness could be shared safely with people who had already decided to treat it as useful information. You did not do anything wrong, I told him, but I gave them your address. No, I said. You gave them a fact. They turned the fact into a plan. That is not the same thing, and you are not responsible for what other people do with honest words. He was quiet for a long moment. I could hear him breathing steadily, trying to settle himself. Is there anything I can do? I looked across the room at the folder Preston had left behind. It was still sitting on the edge of my desk, where I had placed it deliberately, so I would see it every morning and not let myself forget what had walked through my front door wearing the face of family concern. Yes, I said. I need you to be at my house on the 12th of April. What happens then? I picked up my coffee again, but it had gone cold while we were talking. Then, I said, your parents hear the truth in front of people who cannot be rewritten afterward. For 6 weeks, I did not confront anyone. I let Lorraine send small, careful messages about the weather and a cousin's engagement, and a recipe she had found that she thought I might enjoy. I let Glenn leave one voicemail about how family misunderstandings should always be handled with grace and open communication. I let Preston email me 2 more versions of the trust proposal, each one more refined than the last, each one written as though my signature was simply a formality waiting for the right quiet moment. Meanwhile, Frances worked. She brought in a private investigator named Mr. Kowalski, a man so methodical that he made me look impulsive by comparison. By the first week of April, we had documented records of Glenn's business history, Lorraine's loan applications and rejections from the previous 4 years, a thorough background report on Preston, the active complaint from the man in New Hampshire, and printed records of phone calls in which Glenn had discussed the importance of, as he put it to one contact, getting Arthur to sign before he gets suspicious. I read that sentence in the document Frances presented to me, and I stayed with it for a long time. Not before Arthur gets confused. Not before Arthur needs help navigating this. Before he gets suspicious. That was not the language of a concerned family member. That was the language of a man running a timeline. So I gave them the one thing they wanted most, an invitation. I told Lorraine I had been giving serious thought to the family trust proposal and would like to discuss it at a small spring gathering at the lake house. I said there would be a few people present whose opinions I valued. Glenn replied within 4 minutes of her message to him. Of course he did. On the 12th of April, my lake house held the kind of gathering I had never hosted before. Old colleagues from the firm who had known me through 3 decades of quiet, careful work. My neighbor Cecil, who talked too much and meant well, and had the kind of face that made it hard to lie in front of him. My doctor, who arrived early and stationed himself near the kitchen, with a cup of tea like a man who already knew what the afternoon would require of him. Miriam, my former supervisor, who had hired me in the first year of my career and never once needed me to be anyone other than exactly what I was. And Dylan, standing near the porch door with his hands in the front pockets of his jacket, looking a full year older than his age. Lorraine and Glenn arrived just after noon. Glenn wore a blazer over a collared shirt and brought a bottle of wine that cost more than anything he had ever brought to my apartment in all the years I had lived there. Lorraine went to the kitchen first, moving through the space with her eyes doing their quiet inventory of the appliances, the cabinetry, the view through the window above the sink. Preston was not with them. I had not extended the invitation to Preston. I wanted Glenn to stand in that room without the young man he had been using as a professional shield. For 3 hours, I let the gathering move naturally. Food, coffee, conversation that drifted across familiar ground. Glenn worked the room with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his life managing impressions, touching shoulders, laughing at his own stories, positioning himself near Miriam and Cecil and my former colleagues, as if proximity to their respect might transfer onto him like cologne. Then at 3 in the afternoon, I asked everyone to come into the living room. Glenn took a seat near the front with a settled, expectant expression. He believed, right up until the moment I opened my mouth, that he was about to receive something. I stood near the fireplace because I wanted everyone to see my hands clearly. No shaking, no papers gripped too tightly, no old man losing his composure in his own living room on a cold April afternoon. Just me, standing the way I had always stood, the way Glenn had always misunderstood. Quiet. Lorraine, I said first, because she was still my sister. That had not changed even after everything. For most of my life, I never asked for money from you. I never asked for your praise. I only wanted to exist in this family without being treated like I was already behind. Her jaw tightened, but she did not speak. I turned to Glenn. In January of this year, I said, you contacted a probate attorney and asked specific questions about what would happen to my estate in the event of my death without a will. You asked how a family member could establish financial oversight of a relative who appeared to be managing wealth irresponsibly. You did this 6 weeks before you arrived at this house. The room became so still I could hear the wind off the lake pressing against the windows. Glenn's smile did not fall away cleanly. It collapsed in stages, like something losing structural support from the inside. That is not what happened, he said. His voice was already slightly too high. Before he could add another word, Frances stepped from the hallway holding a bound document. She placed it in front of him with the care of someone setting down something that could not be taken back. He looked at the letterhead. Whatever blood had been in his face moved somewhere else. The attorney cooperated fully, I said. The consultation is documented. The questions you asked are on record. The date is on record. Lorraine said my name very quietly. Arthur, please. Preston, I continued, is not a licensed financial advisor. The man you brought into my home with a printed trust proposal holds a single online certificate with no regulatory standing. He is currently connected to a complaint in New Hampshire involving an elderly man and $60,000 missing from an investment account. Glenn stood up halfway from his chair and stopped, suspended between sitting and whatever he thought standing would accomplish. You are twisting this completely. From the back of the room, Miriam's voice arrived like a closing cabinet drawer. Sit down, Glenn. And he did. That was the first time in my memory that Glenn had obeyed anyone in a room without turning the obedience into a small performance. He sat down, and for a moment he looked like a much older and much smaller man than the one who had walked in 40 minutes earlier, carrying wine he could not afford. I looked around the room at every face that was now carrying the same understanding. At Cecil, who had gone very still. At my colleagues, who had known me when I was the man nobody celebrated, and who now sat quietly with something that looked close to recognition. At my doctor, who held his tea with both hands and watched everything carefully. Then I said, this is not a misunderstanding. This is a pattern. I did not raise my voice. I think that was the thing that undid Glenn most completely. He had prepared for anger. Men like him are practiced at managing anger. They can call it confusion. They can call it grief. They can tell anyone who will listen that the family is worried and that you overreacted and that you have always been difficult. But calm facts, spoken plainly, in front of witnesses who are already holding the documents, do not leave anywhere soft to land. I am not here to ask for an apology, I said, and I am not here to punish anyone. I am here to be clear. Lorraine looked at me then in a way she had not looked at me in a very long time, as if she had finally stopped waiting for me to say something small or uncertain, as if she was seeing, for the first time in our shared life, that the quiet brother she had dismissed for 63 years had not been quiet because he was lost. He had been quiet because he was listening. This is the end of every conversation about my money, I said. My estate, my property, my health, my home. You will not discuss trusts with me. You will not send Preston to contact me. You will not suggest that I need family supervision or managed oversight. And you will not use the appearance of concern as a key to my front door. Glenn's mouth opened. What came out was not words exactly. It was the sound of a man who had run out of script in a scene he thought he had written. Lorraine whispered, "We were only trying to protect you." "No," I said. "You were trying to position yourselves close enough to benefit when something happened to me. That is not protection. That is preparation." Frances stepped beside me then, holding the folder that contained everything.
"For legal clarity," she said, in a voice that required no amplification, "Arthur's estate documents have been fully updated and secured. His accounts are protected under current legal structure. His healthcare directive is established and on file with the appropriate parties. Any attempt to interfere with his property, finances, or medical decisions will be handled through my office."
Glenn looked at her, then at me, then at the room. "You cannot just cut out family," he said. "I am not cutting out family," I said. "I am cutting off access. There is a difference. Family can still sit at a table. Family can still call when the winter gets hard. What family cannot do is arrive with a folder and a fake advisor and questions about what happens when you die, and then call it love." I looked at my sister one final time. "You wanted a place in my life," I said, and I kept my voice as steady as I had kept it through all of it. "You should have started by caring whether I was still living in it." Dylan was standing near the porch door with his hands buried in his jacket pockets. He had been there through the whole of it, shoulders tight, eyes moving between me and his parents and the floor. He looked young in that moment, younger than 20, younger than the voice that had called me from a parking lot and warned me about people who were supposed to love him. "Dylan," I said. He lifted his head slowly. "I want everyone in this room to understand something clearly. Dylan did not cause this. He did not betray anyone. He saw something happening that was wrong, and he chose to say so when staying quiet would have been far easier. That matters." Lorraine's face changed in a way I had not seen before. Not anger this time, something closer to fear. The specific fear of a parent who realizes that their child has stopped being theirs to manage and has become someone else's witness. Glenn turned on him immediately. "You called him?" Dylan swallowed once. He did not look away from me. "I did," he said. 2 words, small voice, a spine that held. Before Glenn could say anything further, Frances stepped forward. "Dylan is not a party to this dispute," she said. "He will not be addressed or pressured here." I looked at my nephew. "I set up a college fund for you last week," I said. "It is separate from my estate, structured outside of anything your parents can access or influence. It has nothing to do with Glenn's debts or your mother's plans or what anyone in this room thought they were going to control. It is simply yours. You get to study what you actually want to study. not what makes someone else's choices look better, not what covers someone else's mistakes. Your life is still your own. Dylan stood there for a long moment. I could see him trying to process it, this information arriving in the middle of an afternoon that had already asked too much of him. Then his face broke. Not into tears, exactly. Into something older and more necessary than tears. Into relief. And in that moment, for the first time all day, I felt something close to peace. Lorraine and Glenn left before dinner. Lorraine paused at the front door and looked back at me. I could see her searching for the sentence that would restore her position, the one that would recast her as the concerned sister, the misunderstood wife, the woman who had only been trying to help. But the room behind me held too many people who had heard everything, and for once, there was no sentence large enough to cover it. Glenn walked straight to the car without turning around. I think that was his real punishment. Not the documents, not Francis, not the witnesses watching him from the living room window. The silence. A man who had built his entire life on the management of other people's impressions had finally run out of audience in a room that mattered to him, and he had nothing left to perform. But the afternoon was not the end of it. By the following week, Francis confirmed that the complaint against Preston had been forwarded with our full documentation attached. His financial consulting profile disappeared from the internet in stages, as these things tend to do when they can no longer withstand a clear look. The New Hampshire case, which had been sitting quietly in a filing system somewhere, did not continue sitting quietly. Glenn's professional life shifted in ways I did not engineer and did not need to. Business contacts heard enough to ask questions I had not prompted them to ask. Two families he had been pursuing for insurance policies pulled back from the conversations. A long-standing professional relationship he had mentioned with the quiet pride of a man holding a good hand went silent without explanation. These things move the way water moves. Slowly and then all at once and through whatever opening is already there. Lorraine called Dylan 3 times over the following week. He answered once. After that, he sent her a message saying he needed space until she was able to speak to him without defending Glenn. That reached her in a way none of the rest of it had. Not my attorney. Not the documents. Not the witnesses. Her son had seen the truth clearly and chosen distance, and that was a loss no legal filing could have delivered. After they were gone, the house felt different. Not lighter in a cheerful way. Lighter the way a room feels after a hard conversation has finally been finished, when the air stops feeling like it is being held and simply becomes air again. Cecil talked through most of dinner, as he always did, filling the space with his good heart and his loud opinions about things that did not matter. Miriam stayed until the sky turned purple over the lake, sitting with her tea and saying very little. Frances packed her folders without ceremony and paused at the door long enough to say, in her precise way, "You did well." Coming from her, that was everything. Later, Dylan and I sat on the back porch, with coffee neither of us especially needed. The last light of the day was doing something quiet and generous over the water. And for the first time since he had arrived that morning, he looked like he could breathe, without calculating what breathing would cost him. "They are going to be angry with you for a long time," he said. "For a while," I agreed. He turned his mug in his hands slowly. "Was it worth it?" I looked at the water. I looked at the house I had built my way into, one careful, unremarkable choice at a time, across 3 decades when no one was watching and no one expected anything. Protecting myself was worth it, I said. The fact that I had to protect myself from my own family is the part that will take longer to make peace with. Dylan nodded slowly, like a young man absorbing something he did not yet have the years to fully hold. He graduates in the spring. Environmental engineering, a field he chose without asking anyone's permission or approval. When he called to tell me, I could hear him smiling through the phone. That sound alone made every quiet decision I had ever made feel exactly right. I am 63 years old. I drink my coffee on that porch every morning and watch the mist lift off Lake Champlain in long, slow sheets. The estate is protected. The accounts are secure. The life I built through 3 decades of patient, unrecognized work belongs entirely to me, documented and defended, and no longer available to people who see it primarily as a resource. For most of my life, people like Lorraine and Glenn needed me to be small. If I was small, their choices looked bigger. If I was unremarkable, their ambitions looked more real by comparison. If I was lonely enough, their attention could be mistaken for generosity. But the truth has a way of waiting without complaint. It does not need to raise its voice. It does not need a room full of people applauding it. It just needs one careful person, willing to keep records, save documents, read the room without flinching, and refuse to sign away a life they built with their own 2 hands over 31 quiet years. I used to believe that peace was something other people extended to you when they finally recognized your worth. I thought it was granted by the people who had withheld it for so long. I was wrong. Peace is what remains when you stop requesting permission from the wrong people to exist inside your own life. Every morning now, the mist lifts off Lake Champlain and the house settles into its silence. Not the silence of an empty room. Not the silence of a man waiting for someone to notice him. The silence of a life that has arrived where it was always heading, even when no one else could see where that was. That kind of quiet does not need an explanation. It just needs to be left alone. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Would you have confronted them the moment you understood what they were doing? Or would you have stayed quiet and gathered every piece of proof first? And have you ever seen someone underestimate another person so completely that the truth, when it finally arrived, was almost beautiful? Subscribe for more emotional stories about betrayal, survival, and the kind of justice that arrives without raising its voice.